10 times in the Authorized, that's King James, 14 times in the NIV, the little phrase, in the eyes of the Lord, shows up. And I want to run through some of those with you. Turn to 1 Kings. The first one is in chapter 11 and verse 6. And I want you to think about how God looks on life. We look on it like, oh, I'm doing real well. You know, I'm still employed and I'm healthy, and oh, I don't feel very well. I just lost my job. Oh, now I feel really well because I just got some good news. Oh, now I don't feel very well. And we just run along, and we basically are looking at life in these little tiny ups and downs. And God looks at a life in its entirety. And when he looks at it, he just has one-word descriptions of our life. Good or bad. I thought that's very interesting. Good or bad. Not almost good and not real bad, just good or bad. And it's an interesting concept that we need to kind of grasp and live for what will make him say good. It says in verse 6 of chapter 11 of 1 Kings, and Solomon did evil, that's bad, in the sight of the Lord. Emprosthen. You know what that means? In front of the face of the Lord. In fact, the Lord's table is a takeoff, because of the unleavened bread and everything that we use, from the tabernacle in the temple. And the temple had the table of the face, or the showbread. And what that meant is, it was a table of bread that they set out in the old-fashioned tabernacle and in the Israelite kingdom time. And they would just put those loaves of bread there, the showbread. And we always read that and we think, showbread, who are they showing it to? You know, what's it there for? And what it was is, it was a time when God was on one side of the table and the priest was on the other side of the table. And it was like they were meeting at the table, and they were face to face in front of that bread. And God says, you live your whole life in front of my face. He says, and I'm watching. Okay, let's look at the second one, chapter 14, verse 22. Now notice the first one was an individual, Solomon. King Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, the second reference is 14:22. Judah, that's an entire kingdom, a nation. And the whole nation did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy. Remember, God is jealous. You ever been jealous? You ever dated someone and someone else dated them and you went, oh. You know, you were jealous because, or did someone ever get something you wanted and you were jealous? Jealousy has a good side because God, it says, I am jealous. That's one of his names. One of his eternal character revelations to us is he is jealous. God is jealous. Now, he's not jealous because he says, you got something I don't have. He says, everything belongs to me and you took it. And I'm jealous for that and I want it. And I want your attention. And I want your obedience. And I want you to make me the priority. And if you don't, he's jealous. And it is very upsetting. And it says that it did evil, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins which they committed more than all their fathers had done. See, God was very, very jealous for them. He says, you belong to me. Now think of the New Testament. For you are what? Bought with a price. Therefore glorify God with your body, which is his. See, God's jealous. We belong to him. I mean, just as much in the marriage relationship, two people commit themselves for life to one another to exclusively, not only physically, but also emotionally and mentally, to be totally committed to faithfulness to one another. They are not to be thinking about others. They are not to have emotional attachments and any physical attachments to anybody else. They are supposed to have a total singleness toward one another. God says, when you got saved, you became my bride. That's what we are. And what it is he's saying, you are all going to be united with me sometime in heaven. The marriage celebration is going to be up there. Until that, you're engaged to me and you can't date anybody else. I'm jealous. Well, they did. They were dating. And you say, well, what do you mean by dating? Well, what did they do? Verse 23, they built for themselves high places. What are those things? Well, those are kind of spiritual helps. They thought, well, this will help me. I'm going to go up in a high place, burn some incense, and some of it will be to God and some of it will be to other gods. But we just, it's kind of this religious aura that people have in America. They have a bunny foot and they have a little image and they wear something around their neck and they go to church and they hope it'll all pan out. God says, that provokes me. I'm the only one you're supposed to worship. Not only high places, but they had wooden images on every hill, under every green tree. That had to do with immorality. And they're also perverted persons in the land. Perverted? These are the homosexuals. God calls them that in the Scriptures. Perverted. And so there was a laxity morally and a laxity religious and spiritually. And God says he didn't like that in his sight. Look at chapter 15 and verse 5. Here's another one. And because David did what was right. Remember one word, evil or right, good or bad. Because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and prostin in front of his face, and he didn't turn aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Now, wouldn't that be nice? That if we only blew it once in life? David, except in one matter, never turned aside from... Now, that doesn't mean he never sinned. It meant that the continual direction of his life was toward the Lord. Now, along the way, he made mistakes. He was a very emotional person. That's why we have all the Psalms. He was a very energetic person. He got a lot done. But only in the case of Uriah, murdering him, stealing his wife, lying about it, and all that, did he get out of following the Lord. He willfully stepped away from the Lord. But God says, in spite of him willfully stepping out, his whole direction was good. Isn't that nice? God doesn't say you blow it once, you're out. He says, even though he sinned grievously, he still was good in my sight. In verse 11, another one, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. That's Asa, as his father David had done. Chapter 15, verse 26. And it says, Nadab did evil in the sight of the Lord. He walked in the way of his father, and in his sin by which he had made Israel to sin. Look at verse 34. Here's another one. And Baasha did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he walked in the ways of Jeroboam in his sin by which he had made Israel to sin. Now, if we went through all of them, we could see that God assesses our life of how it panned out, because it was the entire life was lived in his sight. Now, if we played up on our projector screen, this was our life for the last 168 hours. I mean, if you could see what God saw, how would we have done? Was our direction, as it said in 15:5, David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and did not turn aside from anything God commanded him. Have you turned aside this week from anything he commanded you? He said, seek me first. And you know, there's a great verse in the Psalms that says this, I'll not find a place for my head until, in other words, to sleep, until I found a place for you, God, in my life. And I was telling the elders last night, I said, you know what? I think I've brushed my teeth almost every night since my mother taught me that, unless I was catatonic or dead or I'd lost my toothbrush. I mean, I can't hardly go to sleep at night unless I brush my teeth. Does anybody tell me to do that? I mean, do I have to have a daily planner? Does someone have to remind me and hold me accountable? No, I just do it because I want to do it and I need to do it. Do you spend time every day with the Lord? Or do you have to have someone call you or remind you? Do you have to have a checkoff thing? Does someone have to keep harping on it? And do you have to feel guilty because you don't do it? Or have you made it a part of your life? That's what he's saying. And he's saying that he didn't turn aside. And God commanded us that we are to be continually nourished from him. And anytime we live without nourishment from him, we're living in our own strength, and it doesn't please him. He wants us to live in his strength. And that's what it means to live in the sight of the Lord or the sight of God. This expression is repeated those 14 times in this book, and you can read the rest of them. We all need to ponder the theme of this book, and I really believe the theme of this book is in the sight of God. Because it's just, all these men are assessed how they lived, and some of them did great stuff. They built public works projects, and some of them really helped the economy, and some of them really did a lot of great stuff for Israel. But God says their hearts were evil in his sight. And that's something we need to learn, how we look in God's sight. Now we'll look at the book in outline form, and basically the book has two parts. The first 11 chapters are about Solomon's 40 years. And Solomon was king 40 years, David was king 40 years, Saul was king 40 years. Remember that from Walk Through the Bible, 40, 40, 40. Solomon had a good start. The first 4 chapters are about his good start. He just followed right after David, and he was equitable and was a good king. In 5 through 8, not only did he have a good start, he made the right choices. Like God says, I'll give you anything. And he could have said, let's see, I want to live to be 1,000. I want to have all the gold in the world. No, he just said, I want wisdom. God says, good choice. You have made a wise decision. Then, in chapters 9 and 10, God gave him fame and fortune unrivaled. He said that no king on earth had wealth so absolutely abundant as Solomon did, and nobody was as wise as he was. In fact, there are references we'll look at a little later where people came from all over the world to hear him. And remember the Queen of Sheba, when she came, it says she fainted because her spirit left her because he was so magnificent. He knew. You could ask him about anything. You could ask him about plants. You could ask him about the stars. You could ask him about, this. He knew just divine wisdom. It was wonderful. But he had a bad ending, chapter 11. And it says there, and we'll see exact references soon, his heart was turned away from the Lord. And that's why I enjoy doing the funerals of saints. Do you know why? The greatest day of our life is not the day we were born. It's the last day of our life. The day of a man's death, the day of a woman's death, the day of a child's death is better than the day of their birth. Why? Because you saw what they were. Up until now, we're not sure. You can keep going the right way or you can take a sharp left and go the wrong way. But when your life is over, it's done. And it's the greatest day of your life because what you were is finished. And it's a wonderful thing to think about. Instead of saying, if I live to be 76.4 years old, which is the average age, I've only got 36.4 more years. No. I'm looking forward to the last day because I want to live to the last day for His glory. I asked guys like Lehman Strauss, I said, what's your goal? He says, I want to finish and be found faithful to the end. He said, I don't care if I write another book, preach another Bible conference. I just want to be faithful to the end. I hope all of us want that. Second part, major division, is the divided kingdom, 80 years long. So this book covers 120 years of the history of the nation of Israel. The first chapter of the second half, chapter 12, it's the Reheboam Complex. You know what that is? It's what we're seeing in our era, where you don't want to listen to any of the old wise people. You just take the young guys' opinions. And it's just a tragic thing. And Rehoboam, they almost stone him, and they stone his steward. The second division is two new kingdoms, two old problems, chapters 13 through 16. The main problems of these people comes up again. Idolatry and disobedience. Idolatry, they set up those golden calves in the north, and disobedience in the south. They're allying themselves with God's enemies. They're half-worshiping idols. They're forgetting about God. The whole temple breaks down. They lose the Word of God. They forget the Passover, and they just disobey, and they forget God. Third division, Elijah. Now here comes a bright light. Chapter 17 through 19 is Elijah, God's man who stands alone. And if there's anything we need to teach young people in our world, it's how to stand alone. That means if everybody else in their class is making fun of God, they won't. And if the teacher is leading them all astray, they'll get up and walk out. And they will stand alone. If the whole athletic team is talking smutty, they'll get up and stand up. They learn to stand alone. If the whole sales group is fudging, they don't fudge. They learn to stand alone. Elijah is an example. We're going to meet him and go through his life. And finally, Ahab, the worst. Now, this book of 2 Kings wasn't intended to be an absolute history. Some of these guys live 11 years and they have about 1.25 column inches on their life. Nothing, like one verse. They did evil in the sight of the Lord, and nothing. But the purpose of this is not to be an exhaustive biography or an annal of all the events of Israel and Judah. It's a story book. God picks out divinely inspired, sent down to us stories to show us something. Okay, there are 19 kings, all bad in the north. You remember that? Israel, Judah, 19 bad guys in the north. In the southern kingdom, there were 19 kings, 8 good guys, and 11 bad guys. And the 11 bad guys were so bad that they torpedoed Judah. And God says, I'm not going to let you exist any longer. You're so sinful. There's so much blood that's been shed. There's so many babies that were murdered. They actually picked up the Canaanite custom, and archaeologists now, when they dig in these ancient Israelite cities, they find under the houses clay jars. I saw pictures this week as I was studying, reading everything I could find in 1 Kings. I saw pictures of these clay pots that have babies in them. And they would just take a living, healthy, firstborn, usually male, and they stick them in the jar, put the lid on, and bury them underneath their house for the Canaanite gods. Canaanite gods were the gods of fertility and rain, child sacrifice. Terrible stuff. And these bad kings led them in that. As Saul, who had no heart for God, David, who had a whole heart for God, and Solomon, who had only a half a heart for him, these 38 kings are a mixture of all three. We find some that almost exceed David for their zeal for the Lord, and we find some that, Ahab notably, that are so debauched and so depraved that God curses and causes his curses from Leviticus, the last few chapters of Leviticus, to take place on his people. Okay, now, 4 great truths we can glean from this book. Number 1, God keeps his word, so we should search it daily. God keeps His word. Did you know this whole book is about God will keep His word? We're living in the sight of God. And because we're in His sight, He's looking at us like this, and He's saying, I've said something about that, and if you do this, I'm going to do that. God keeps His word. We're going to see that. So because God keeps His word, write down this little note. We need to search it daily. I'll tell you a little story about a great servant of the Lord. His name was Charlie, or C.T. Studd. He was a professional athlete in England in the 1880s. In 1880, he had 250,000 pounds. And a pound back then, a pound sterling, was a fabulous amount of money. Most people back then, if they made a shilling a day, which was a fifth of a pound, were doing well. So you could make a pound a week. And so a pound, that'd be about $600. 250,000 would be something on the order of $150 million in our currency today. This guy was loaded. Okay? And you know what? He gave all of it up. He signed it over and gave it away. He wrote checks, all 250,000 pounds of sterling. He gave some to George Mueller and his orphanages. He gave some to Hudson Taylor to go to China with. He gave some to all the other ministries. And then he, with his wife, left and went to India, all alone, and started working. And he went from India to China. And then he went from China, and around the first of our century, about 1901, he got to Africa. And he lived in Africa till he died in the 30s. He wouldn't come home. He died of a gallstone, and they said it was larger than a softball. And he would not leave. He said, I will not leave and go to India, or back to England to get that operated on. He died at 77, or 76. He lived a long time. But he lived with the incredible pain of that, because he says, I was called of God to minister the gospel to people that did not know Him. You know what C.T. Studd said? Every morning he got up at 4 a.m. to read his Bible. Why? Because it was so busy in Africa. I mean, no TVs, no faxes, no radios, nothing. But he had to get up at 4 o'clock every morning. And he would have one of his servants blow on the fire and start the coffee pot. And he would sit there by the fire, flickering light, and he'd read his Bible. And every day, as he read his Bible, he would put a check mark by the verses that he was obeying. And he wouldn't put a check mark by the verses he felt he wasn't obeying. And when he died, he had check marks by all the verses. He felt he was obeying God completely. I thought that was an interesting thought. He knew and searched God's Word because he wanted to make sure that he was living in the sight of God. And by the way, when he died, there were 10,000 pygmies. That's who he worked with, the pygmies, that gathered wearing their leaves. When he met them, they wore nothing. 10,000 baptized pygmies were in his home church. Now, that was just his home church. He had sent missionaries out all over the Congo, and they had started churches everywhere. But in the church that he died, and they had the funeral service, there were 10,000 of them. And it says that they sat there in the sun, and their bodies glistened as they perspired, as they sat there for hours, singing praises to God that the white Bawana had gone to be with Christ, and they buried him. Amazing thing to think about. Search the Word of God. You don't have to get up at 4 a.m. You can do it anytime. Just do it. Okay, A, the first thing we learn is God will judge the apostasy. Let's turn to 1 Kings 12, and I want to track you through, and you might want to mark some of these in your Bible, because there's some terrible things that we see happening here. And apostasy, apostasia, is to go away from. It's to abandon the things of God. These are 4 forms of apostasy God has always hated. Okay, here's the first one. The worship that is only of convenience. Look at verse 28 of chapter 12. Therefore, and this is King Jeroboam, he's the king of the north. It says in verse 28, Therefore the king asked advice, made 2 calves of gold, and said to the people, It's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you out from the land of Egypt. And you know what? This hadn't been the first time this happened. You remember Moses tarried too long in the mountain? And so Aaron told the people to take all their gold earrings and nose rings and necklaces off, and he threw them in the fire, and a golden calf came out of the fire? Well, it didn't really, but that's what he said. What it is it was a worship of convenience. They said, it's too hard to wait. Moses has been gone 40 days up there, and it's too long to wait. We want worship now. He said, okay, I'll make you something. Now, that golden calf wasn't an idol of a false god. That was a physical representation of the true God. See, it's a worship of convenience. You know, a lot of people, they have trouble worshiping God, and they need holy hardware. And God says you aren't supposed to use any hardware. You're not supposed to use pictures. I mean, there are Christians, evangelical Christians, that are promoting the idea that you need to have these representations that help you in your prayer. that you need to have a crown of thorns, and you need to have a picture of Jesus, and you need to have this, and you need to visualize him and feel and try and communicate with him. That's a worship of convenience. That's materializing the spiritual, as we'll see in the second one. Look at verse 29. It says, and he set up one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. You know what the people were supposed to do? 7 times a year they were supposed to walk back to Jerusalem. There were 7 feasts, and they were supposed to go back to Jerusalem and go back to the center of Israel and worship God there. And they were supposed to sacrifice. It took a lot of money, it took a lot of time, and they were supposed to plan on it, and they were supposed to go back and celebrate those feasts. Now, sometimes they would just send an offering because they were supposed to set up booths at home, and sometimes they were supposed to actually come down for the Passover and literally be there for the whole feast. And God says it's going to be hard to worship me. Do you know what we have today? We have Barca Lounge recliners, and we have remotes. And we can sit in our Barca Lounge with our soda and our chips and with our widescreen TV, and we can watch some of the best worship services in the world. We never have to even bother getting ready. We don't have to bother sitting by people we don't know. We don't have to bother with inordinately long service because we can turn it off when we don't like it anymore. We don't have to worry about being intimidated with a plate going by. We don't have to be intimidated with someone asking us how our spiritual life is. And we have a worship of convenience in our world. People that go to church on Christmas and Easter. People that come only when they want to. They read the church page and see where the concerts are, where the guest speakers they like. Or they say, I don't like anyone, I just listen to tapes at home. And that's a worship of convenience. Did you know God says we are supposed to, it's supposed to cost us something to go to worship him? That's why we're supposed to bring something with us. Did you know that? You're supposed to not come to get. You're supposed to come to give. And we come to give praise. We come to give ministry to one another and to edify. And we also come to give God an offering. And that's why it's very important to, if you have children, to train them to bring something to God. Now, does God need it? No. He says, the hills are mine, and all the cattle and everything belongs to me, but I want you to show that it's costing you something to come before me. And so think about that. It should cost you something to come on Sunday. It should cost you time getting ready. You ought to start getting ready for Sunday on Saturday sometime. You ought to wind down the life. You shouldn't go the last minute on Saturday night. Have you ever been kind of tired on Sunday morning? Kind of, oh man, I can't get with it here. What did you do the night before? It's something to think about. A worship of convenience. We live in a world of convenience. We live in a world that they have to materialize the spiritual. Did you wonder where we got all the orders of monks from in the Catholic Church? Did you ever wonder where the candles and the Mass and all the stuff that goes on in a lot of so-called Christian churches comes from? Every one of them is tied to a spiritual truth. But especially the Roman Church tried to materialize all the spiritual things. And so that's why they had the priests wear these outfits. And every part, every piece that they wear is supposed to be reflecting something from the Bible. Every signal that they do and every incantation and all the stuff they used to say in Latin, all of them were just a materialization of a spiritual thing. That's why they sprinkle babies at birth. Because they were trying to show that they were born with sin and they're trying to get rid of that sin. And that's why they confirm them and that's why they have all those sacraments, because they're trying to materialize the spiritual. God says that's wrong. You don't try and make physical what is only spiritual. Look at the third one in verse 31. This worship always, apostasy, departing from the truth, always lowers God's standard. Verse 31, he made shrines in high places, and listen to this, he made priests from every class of people who were not of the sons of Levi. God's very exclusive who can represent him. There are a lot of rules that God says if you're going to be an elder, you have to meet a lot of character qualifications. If you're going to be a deacon, you have to meet a lot of character qualifications. God says that is a high calling, and you've got to be very special, and you've got to be desiring and living a life. Well, look what he did. He says, man, I'm not going to pick people from Levi. I don't have any people from Levi. They've all deserted me. He was in the north, and Levi had all, the scriptures tell us that all the Levites left and migrated south because they really wanted to worship the true God. They didn't want to worship cows. And so he didn't have any Levites. And so he said, I'm going to keep my thing going. I'm going to let anybody be a priest. Did you know that's where our world's going to now? Did you know what God says? God says that he has gender-specific roles. And he says that women are spiritual and gifted and godly, and men are to be spiritual and gifted and godly, but in his church, the church is to be led by spiritual, gifted, and godly men, not by spiritual, gifted, godly men and women. Where is our world going now? Who are filling the seminaries now? Women. Who are taking over the pastorates of most mainline churches today? Women. Why? Because that's a part of where our world is going. It's a worship of convenience. It's a worship that lowers God's standard. In the last days, God said that would happen. And you know what it says in the book of Revelation? You know the description of the global church? It's called a harlot. Because it's a total prostitution of God's standards in this global church that teaches nothing, believes nothing, and offends no one but God. Now look at verse 33. Finally, not only do they have a convenient worship that materializes the spiritual, lowering God's standards, but they totally disregard God's commands. Verse 33. So he made offerings on the altar which he had made at Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month which he had devised in his own heart. You know when God said to do it? The 7th month. So when did he do it? The 8th month and the 11th day. Or the 15th day of the 8th month instead of the 10th day of the 7th month. You see, he made up his own rules. He totally disregarded God's commands. And he ordained a feast for the children of Israel. He burnt sacrifices on the altar, and he burned incense. In other words, this Jeroboam is the epitome of an apostate. An apostate is someone that knows the Word of God, and they make a worship form that's convenient, not sacrificial. They make it materialized. They make it very easy to follow. They don't have anything hard, nothing spiritual. They lower God's standard, and they totally wipe out his commandments and forget about him. Okay, secondly, not only will God judge apostasy, and he judges that, and you can read through that, but secondly, false worship will bring his wrath. You know what? Not only does apostasy something God will judge, but this false worship makes God's wrath be directed. And you know that's why the book of Revelation, if you read it closely in the 17th chapter of Revelation, it's the destruction of this world church. God will only tolerate false religion so long. And he is literally going to destroy the false church that's on this planet during the tribulation time. And he describes it. He said he's going to totally demolish them and burn and destroy. That's part of the tribulation. Letter C. God also punishes disobedience. Now remember, what we're looking at is that God keeps his word. He promised all this, and he does it. And the reference there is 1 Kings 13:21. If you want to read this, this is a great story. This is about a little prophet that God tells him to do something, and he does do what he says. And in verse 21, God had told him not to eat or drink. I mean, it's a little thing. He says, I want you to go up, I want you to deliver this prophecy, and I want you, as soon as you deliver it, turn around and go straight home, and don't stop for any food, and don't stop for anything, just go back home. Okay, what did God tell him to do? Go give the prophecy, don't stop, don't eat, and go home. What does he do? He goes and gives a prophecy, and in verse 18, this old fellow comes up and he says, hey, I'm a prophet too. Now, it was lonely back then to be a prophet. Kind of like lonely being a Christian in a secular environment and world we live in. So this guy says, wow, you're a prophet too? The guy said, yeah, I'm a prophet. And listen, an angel spoke to me by the word of the Lord, and he says, bring this prophet back to your house and let him eat bread, drink water. Parenthesis, he was lying to him. Here's a little principle. If the Bible says something, and someone says an angel told him something else, which are you supposed to follow? Bible. Did you know God will never have an angel or Jesus appearing or anything else to tell you anything that's contrary to the Bible? Did you know that? Have you really thought about that? Did you know that wipes out about 90% of all this shenanigans going on in our world? Did you know the Bible says that nobody that's truly preaching the gospel is in it for the money? Turn off your TV set. I mean, we were snowed in Hot Springs, and I found the religious channel. I think everybody that sang there, they had to have gotten osteoporosis from all the gold jewelry they were wearing and their Rolexes, and I mean, they had the most neat clothes on, and they had such dark suntans, they couldn't work. They had to be in a sun hut all the time to get that. I mean, it's just amazing. And I thought about how the scriptures say that it's not making merchandise of the gospel. Don't you see that nowadays? I just talked to someone today, a businessman. You know what he told me? He said there was a religious leader in this town who wouldn't allow anybody to do business with them unless they met one of his helpers at a restaurant with an envelope with money in it. Now, that wasn't buying anything except his attention. That was a religious leader in this town. making merchandise of the gospel. Well, what happens is, this is a great story. I've got to read all this. Verse 19, so he went back with him. Even though the word of God, directly from God, told him one thing, this other guy controverted it, and he lied to him, and the poor prophet doesn't stick with the revelation of God. He takes somebody else's revelation, which usually is inaccurate. He went back with him. They had a party. I mean, can you imagine an old prophets gathering? Oh, boy, where all of you prophesied? Oh, I've been a prophet in this many places. And they were just sharing stories. Now it happened, as they sat at the table, verse 20, the word of the Lord came to the prophet who had brought him back. So see, this old guy really was a prophet. He was just disobedient this time. And he cried to the man of God who came from Judah. Listen to this, verse 21. Thus says the Lord, because you have disobeyed the word of the Lord, and have not kept the commandment which the Lord your God commanded you, but you came back, you ate bread, you drank water in the place which the Lord said to you, eat no bread, drink no water, your corpse, boy, God's rough, isn't he? Your corpse shall not come to the tomb of your fathers. In other words, you're going to die before you get home, buddy. Now look what happens. If you haven't read this before, it's really shocking. So it was after he had eaten bread and after he had drunk. I tell you what, I couldn't have eaten anymore after that. But, he just finished his meal and drank his drink, that he saddled up the donkey for him and the prophet whom he had brought back. And when he was gone, verse 24, a lion met him on the road and killed him. And listen to this. And his corpse was thrown on the road, and the donkey stood by it, and the lion stood by the corpse. Now, God had to do this. I mean, can you imagine the donkey sticking around? I wouldn't have. Even a donkey would know to stay away from a lion. And here's this guy laid out, mauled and bitten and dead, donkey on one side, lion on the other. They just waited. And, of course, you know the story. What happened was this. Somebody passed by, verse 25. They saw it. They ran home, told the prophet, verse 26. And he says, the man of God who was disobedient to the word of the Lord, and the Lord delivered him to the lion. And so he ran back and got him and buried him. You know what the lesson is? God punishes disobedience. Now, he doesn't work as graphically and swiftly today as he did back then. It says that he waits, and he waits, and he waits with us. But God punishes disobedience. Galatians 6, be not deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. The one who sows to please his sinful nature, from that nature will reap destruction. You know what I mean by that? What God means by that? It means if you keep giving in to your lust is going to destroy you. I don't know if you've learned this yet. Things that were easy to say no to when you were 12 are very hard when you get 30. And when you get to be 70, you'd probably never say no to them. You understand what I mean? If you have not developed in discipline, it's a miracle to develop it when you get on in life. Because if we're sowing to our flesh, if we're constantly doing things to make ourselves happy, if we're always, coddling ourselves and saying, oh, you deserve a break. No, it's too hard to go out. It's raining. Don't go to DE or EE tonight. Or, yes, you promised you'd do that, but it's just too hard and you might get stuck. And if you give in to yourself all the time, you're feeding your flesh, and your flesh will grow in strength. And it will destroy your spiritual vitality. Letter D, last one. God doesn't forget his warnings. 1 Kings 16:34 says, in Ahab's time, and this is really neat. If you want to turn there to 1 Kings 16:34, this one is a zinger, okay? It says, let me start in verse 29. In the 38th year of Asa, and for any of you that don't know when that is, that's 868 BC. Okay, that was 868 years before Christ. The son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. Now Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord. Verse 31, it came to pass as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in these sins, that verse 32, he set up an altar for Baal, and verse 33, he made a wooden image. Now look at verse 34. In his day, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. Wait a minute. When did Jericho get destroyed? It was destroyed in about the year 1406. BC. That is exactly 537 years prior. And when it was destroyed, Joshua prophesied that the person that rebuilt it, that they were going to lay the foundation with their firstborn, they were going to lay the city gate. That meant the conclusion of the city. That's hanging the garage door with their youngest. Now look at this. In the day Hiel of Bethel built Jericho, he laid its foundation with Abiram his firstborn, and with his youngest son Segub he set its gates, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke through Joshua. Point number 4, God doesn't forget his warnings. Did you know that? Did you know God doesn't forget? I'm a parent, and I warn my children. I say, don't you dare do that again. I'll forget sometimes. You know, the kids remember. A lot of times I don't. In my age, hardening of the arteries or whatever it is, I forget. You know what? God never forgets. He's long-suffering. He's patient. He's merciful. He never forgets. God keeps his word. That's all we've been looking at here. God keeps his word. That's why we should search it. That's why we should try and understand it and know it and ask him to illuminate it to us, because he will judge apostasy. Don't turn from him. Don't take the worship of convenience or materialization or lowering his standards or disregarding his commands. Don't worship false gods. That brings his wrath. Don't disobey him. He'll punish it. And don't forget his warnings, because he doesn't. That's the first point. The second thing we can glean is God rewards obedience. So we should obey him always. 3 words on point 2. God rewards obedience, so we should obey him always. You know, it's like this. There's a lady here in church that gives out candy on Sunday. You don't have to ask for it. You just have to go over and stand by her and smile. And the kids all know that if they just go over there and stand by her and smile, and you see her, she has this great big bag, and she's just giving it out. Did you know what? God rewards obedience. You just have to go and stand by him and smile and obey him, and he just dishes it out. He rewards. He loves obedience. He will heap up. I mean, look what he did for Solomon, the old goat. I mean, he was a lustful, disobedient, half-hearted. God heaped up the blessings, because as long as he obeyed him, he just poured it on. And if God will bless the duplicity and the disobedience and everything else that Solomon did, can you imagine how richly we can be blessed by him if we'll just obey him? You see why old C.T. Studd at 4 a.m. was out there by the flickering firelight checking off the verses? He's saying, God rewards obedience. Obey him now. Remember Solomon. Here's some of the blessings. His personal income God sent him in 1 Kings 10:14 was $400 million a year. Pretty good for 3,000 years ago. You know, we think of $400 million today, and you know what? I think Paul McCartney has $400 million. I mean, you know, so it's not a big deal. I mean, you can just grow your hair out and sing and make $400 million. $400 million 3,000 years ago was a lot of money. He was the wealthiest man in history. I mean, he wouldn't even allow silver in his town. It's too cheap. Everything was made of gold. All of his utensils, all of his drinking vessels, all of his stuff. He wouldn't look at anything but gold. Wealthy. B, his wisdom from God was known around the world. You can read about that. Let me just read this. Remember Elijah. In 1 Kings 17:7, Elijah finds a place of faith. Faith emerges from real need. And what we find there is that Elijah came to a point of desperation, and he had to choose between trusting God or doing his own thing, and he trusted God. And if you really want to have your faith increased, don't try and be like our culture, which tries to erase all needs. If we are not trusting God, we will never know when our brook dries up. Do we really need God? You see, Elijah went where he had no other source but God to take care of him, and God brought the raven in, the aerial food, and had this little spring. And you know what? When the spring dried up and the raven stopped coming, he knew he wasn't supposed to stay there anymore. But if he had planned it out himself, he would never have known that God was leading him. We need to resist our culture, our world trying to erase all needs, and we need to need God. Elijah finds a test of faith, because faith will challenge our deepest fears. You know what God asked him to do? He asked him to go to Jezebel's hometown. Now, Jezebel had a death warrant on him, going to kill him on sight. And let's say that she's from, Okmulgee. So God says, go to Okmulgee. I mean, can you imagine that? Going to right where she's from? Amazing. His personal safety. Secondly, a racial bias. He was a good Jew, and he was supposed to go where the Sidonians were. And that's a lot about racial bias. And God is not. He doesn't have any racial bias. And equity and impartiality are part of his character. It says in Romans 2:11, God does not show favoritism. Ephesians 6:9, it says, there is no favoritism with him. Colossians 3:25, anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong, and there's no favoritism with God. James 2, my brothers, don't show favoritism. If you show favoritism, you are convicted by the law and have sinned as a lawbreaker. You know what that word favoritism means? It's a very interesting word. It's the word, 2 words. The word take and the word face. And it says you take people by their face. And just by looking at them, if you make a value judgment by just looking at them, by looking at how well they're dressed or what color they are, and if you make a decision based on that, that's favoritism. And God says He is absolutely diametrically opposed to any type of favoritism based on looking at someone's face. If it's dirty, if it's a different race, if it's not wealthy, and if you make a decision on that, that is totally opposite of God's character. Aren't you glad He doesn't base His dealings with us on our dirty faces or the color of our heart? He doesn't have any bias. And another thing is that God created only one race. It always bothers me when it says, what race are you? Have you ever filled out, applications? What race are you? I always write down there's only one. What do you mean, what race am I? Human. What do I'm not an android and I'm not extraterrestrial. Human. I wish I could just write human on there, but they don't accept that. You got to write, and it's getting longer all the time. Have you noticed that? It used to be there were like 3, and now there are about 9, and it's going to get, pretty soon they're going to have, that's just the way the world's going. But number 3, God seeks devotion. That's the 4th truth we can learn. So we should, and write in these 3 words, worship Him wholeheartedly. I made that one long word, wholeheartedly. God doesn't want half-hearted worship. And I hate to keep stomping on this, but if you only get so many times to worship God a week corporately, then you ought to really get ready for it. It's kind of like if someone asks you out for a big meal, and they give you a gold leaf invitation, and they send a car over to pick you up, like a limousine or something. Do you just come right from the garden with dirt all over you and a straw in your mouth and go, okay, I'm ready to go now? Don't you kind of get ready? And we were just somewhere and we saw these people in these crazy get-ups, and the girls had flowers strapped to their arms, and I think they got ready for that thing because it was special to them. Worship is the highlight of the week. Worship Him wholeheartedly. He wants our hearts. Chapter 9, verse 4 says He wants our trust. He wants us to come in expecting something. When you come on Sunday or Wednesday, or if you have any other times of corporate worship with other Christians, don't just come and just say, come expecting, come looking around. I always look for the blessing. I just can't wait. Finally, number 4, God expects priority. So we should seek Him first. He expects priority in our day. The very first thing out of your mouth or on your mind ought to be something to God in the morning. Don't go, oh, I'm getting old, or oh, I'm late. Just say, when morning gilds the sky, my heart's awakening cry, may Jesus Christ be praised. Seek Him first. Those are the lessons from 1 Kings. As you can tell, it's a good book. Father, you want us to be devoted to you. You say, worship me with all your heart. You said we can seek you and find you only when we seek with all of our heart. And the first step toward all of our heart is giving our heart and life to you, casting ourselves totally upon you, calling on your name for our salvation. Oh Lord, I pray that you will help us to seek you wholeheartedly and first, and to search your word, and to live in such a way that we obey you because you keep your word. Challenge our hearts and change us